everyone, welcome to another AQA poetry video by TGS English. This is Mrs. Viola, and today I'm going to be going through the poem The Emigree with you. We are getting towards the end of the poetry anthology now, so hopefully you're starting to feel a bit more comfortable with your annotating and working with the poems. So before we start, let's have a look at what you need. As usual, you will need your highlighters and your pens so that you can highlight and annotate the poem as you go, and if possible, a paper copy of the poem. So if you're able to print one out, that would be great. If you can't, then you can use a Word document, as you have probably done before. Simply get the poem off of the internet and copy it into Word, and then you can highlight and annotate it on your computer. Just remember to save the document once you're done so that later on when you're back at school you can print it out for yourself. You're also going to need 3 of these sheets, which you've probably also seen before by now. So the reason you need 3 is because later on in the video I will give you 3 main quotations from the poem to annotate in greater detail. So again, you can either print this out or you can copy it onto a document and then type your notes directly onto these sheets. So let's start the poem. Looking at the title, first of all, The Emigree. That might be a word that sounds slightly familiar to you. It is a version of the word emigrant, which sounds similar to the word immigrant, which is the word you've probably heard. With emigrant, we mean people who've left the country of their birth to settle elsewhere in the world. In particular, the spelling of the title, The Emigree, that the poet has chosen is the feminine form. So this suggests that the emigree, the person who's actually speaking in the poem and telling their story in this poem, is a woman and not a man. So that's just some basic information that you need to jot down either above or next to the title of your poem. At any point in the video, please just pause if you need time to write things down. So as you can gather from the title, what I've told you so far, the theme that we're looking at here is the theme of immigration and the idea of leaving behind one's homeland to move to a new place. So I'm sure a lot of us can relate to this kind of idea. I can definitely relate to this idea, having moved to the UK from South Africa. And for a lot of you, maybe you've been through a similar situation, or maybe your parents or your grandparents moved to the UK from a different country. So I'm sure as you read the poem, quite a lot of you might be able to relate to some of the themes and ideas that are discussed. Before we start reading through the poem, let me just give you an overview of what it's about. So the displaced person, that's the emigree, and when you've been displaced, it basically means that you've kind of been forced to leave a place, usually because of circumstances outside of your control. So in the poem, the emigree is picturing the country and the city where she was born. She doesn't actually name the city or the country specifically, and that seems to be on purpose. It seems to be intentional. So it seems as if Carol Rumens, who is the poet here, wants the poem to be relevant to as many people as possible. So everyone who's been through a similar situation, who's left their homeland and immigrated somewhere else, can relate to this poem because she's chosen not to mention a specific city or country where the emigree has moved from. So the exact location of the city is also not clear. The precise details are sparse. Sparse means that there's not a lot of them. There's not a lot of details at all. You could even, believe maybe that the city that the speaker in the poem is talking about is almost imaginary. That's not even a real place, but she's actually built it up in her imagination. And then finally, something that you should know is that Rumens suggests in her poem that the city and the country are war-torn. So the city is under the control of a dictatorial government. The language that the speaker once knew has been banned. However, despite all of these negative things, and this is sort of the main point of the poem, the speaker cannot shake off the really positive, light-filled impressions and memories of this kind of perfect place that she has in her imagination and that her childhood memories have left with her. If you want to pause for a second and jot some of this down, now would be a good time. Right, hopefully you've got the details down. Let's go on and look at the poet for a second. So, as I mentioned, her name's Carol Rumens, and she was born in 1944 in South London. She's also lived in Belfast, she's lived in South Wales, she's travelled in Russia and Eastern Europe. Now, you might already be realising from this information that the story of the Emigree is not actually Carol Rumens' story. So the situation that we read about in the poem is not actually the poet's own first-hand experience. She's taking on the persona of the Emigree. She's taking on a kind of imaginary role in the poem because it's not a poem about her own life. So it's not an autobiographical poem. The speaker in the poem is not Rumens herself. The Emigree isn't Rumens. So you have to be quite careful here when you're writing about this poem not to mix up the poet, who's Carol Rumens, and the speaker in the poem, who's the Emigree. They are not the same person in this poem. So you just need to be, like I said, a bit careful about when you use the word poet and when you use the word speaker. We're going to do a quick read through of the poem. If you don't understand everything straight away, don't worry. We will come through each stanza in more detail once we've had a read through. So make sure you've got your copy ready. Okay, so it goes like this. There was once a country, I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear, for it seems I never saw it in that November, which I'm told comes to the mildest city. The worst news I receive of it cannot break my original view, the bright, filled paperweight. It may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants, but I am branded by an impression of sunlight. The white streets of that city, the graceful slopes, glow even clearer as time rolls its tanks and the frontiers rise between us, close like waves. That child's vocabulary I carried here like a hollow doll opens and spills a grammar. Soon I shall have every coloured molecule of it. It may by now be a lie, banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. It tastes of sunlight. I have no passport, there's no way back at all, but my city comes to me in its own white plane. It lies down in front of me, docile as paper. I comb its hair and love its shining eyes. My city takes me dancing through the city of walls. They accuse me of absence, they circle me, they accuse me of being dark in their free city. My city hides behind me. They mutter death, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. Before we go through each stanza, let me just give you a few more notes on the form, structure, and language used in this poem. So the form, the main thing that you just need to remember here is that it's written in the first person. So it's first person narrative, and it's about the Emigree's relationship with her homeland and how she feels about the place that she's had to leave behind. Like I've already said, it's not a specifically named place, so it's more of a general exploration of the relationship between people and the places that they've had to leave behind in their childhood. And often these are places which they are unable to return to for whatever reason. As we've already said, the poem is not directly autobiographical. The speaker in the poem is probably a fictional person, and even the city itself imaginary. In terms of the structure of the poem, if you just have a look at it on the page, you'll see that there are three main stanzas. So the first two stanzas are 8 lines each, if you count them up. But then the final stanza has 9 lines instead of 8. So a suggestion has been made that perhaps the reason that the first two have 8 and then the last stanza has 9 is kind of a way of the poet or the speaker showing how she just cannot let go. She can't let go of the memories. She just doesn't want the memories to end, essentially, and so in a way doesn't want the poem to end, and maybe that's why there's one extra line on the end of the last stanza. So that's your first point for structure. In terms of rhyme and rhythm, basically there isn't really any. If you look at the final word on each line, you'll see that there isn't really any sort of rhyme scheme here. You could say that this is purposeful. So the lack of rhythm and rhyme could reflect the speaker's state of mind. So the fact that they don't feel very settled can be shown in this kind of uneasy and complex rhythm and rhyme scheme. Okay, and then lastly, the first two stanzas, if you have a look, there's quite a bit of enjambment. So that's where lines might overflow or lack specific punctuation marks at the end of a line. But in the final stanza, we see a lot more end stopping. So you see quite a few punctuation marks, such as full stops at the end of lines. And you also might notice some really short, sharp sentences in the final stanza. You might want to pause actually and just highlight some of those short sentences and some of the full stops that you see in the final stanza, because those could be an indication of the feelings of the speaker at the end of the poem. So she's in her new city now, away from her homeland, and perhaps the end stop lines and the full stops and the short sentences could show how she feels sort of confined or almost trapped and maybe unhappy in her new city. So if you want to pause again just to take some notes down about structure, you should do that now. Okay, hopefully you've got your notes. We're going to have a little look at the language now. The language in the poem is quite straightforward and natural, kind of conversational. But even though the language might be plain and straightforward, there's a range of language devices that we're going to spot as we analyze. So keep an eye open for metaphors and extended metaphors. There's similes, personification, repetition, lots of figurative language being used throughout the poem. Let's get ready to annotate stanza 1 now. So let's have a read through the beginning. If you look at the first few words, it says, "There once was a country." Now, if you think about it, that sounds a little bit like the opening of a fairy tale, a bit like a once upon a time. So this is kind of an indication of the overwhelming positive viewpoint that the speaker has about her homeland. It's almost like she's got this fairy tale in her mind about how wonderful it was. She says she left it as a child. I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear. So even though she left many years ago, her memory, she believes, is very, very clear. You will notice that she uses light imagery a lot. So this is the first time she mentions sunlight, and keep looking out for repetition of that as we go through the poem. She says then, "For it seems I never saw it in that November, which I'm told comes to the mildest city." If you think about the weather in November, we wouldn't usually think of it as being mild. We'd think of it as being quite cold and wintry. So again, this could be an indication of how she never really saw the city in a negative way. She always has this overwhelmingly sort of like sunny look or sunny view of how her city was or is. She says then in the blue bit, she says, "The worst news I receive of it cannot break my original view." Seems very determined here, sort of saying no matter what she hears about her city, no matter what bad news there is about what's going on there, her original positive and optimistic view of it cannot be broken. And she says the bright filled paperweight. We're going to talk about that in a second. Finally, she says, "It may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants, but I'm branded by an impression of sunlight." So again, she's saying no matter what bad news she hears, no matter how terrible things are in her homeland, she's branded by this positive viewpoint. When you're branded by something, it means it's left a permanent mark on you. So look at all the light imagery here. We've got sunlight, clear, bright, and then again sunlight. Lots of light imagery, so make sure you highlight that and make a note for yourself. It's almost like she has this dreamlike picture where everything is always sunny and everything is always positive in her imagination when she thinks about her city. Back to the paperweight bit, look at the bit in blue again. When she talks about the bright filled paperweight, that's metaphorical. So she could be talking here about her memories being like a paperweight and something that she can hold onto, something solid, and something that for her is bright, so it's filled with positivity. Again, if you need to take a pause here and make some notes, that's fine. I'm going to carry on to stanza 2. So she says here, the white streets of that city, the graceful slopes. Notice she keeps calling it the city or that city. She never mentions it by name. She says the graceful slopes glow even clearer as time rolls its tanks and the frontiers rise between us close like waves. So you'll see that the light imagery carries on here. The white streets, they glow. She's using a lot of overwhelmingly positive imagery here again. The time rolls its tanks and the frontiers rise between us. I'm not going to say too much about that yet because actually I want you to think about that yourself a little bit. Let me just finish the stanza though. So the child's vocabulary that I carried here like a hollow doll opens and spills a grammar. She's talking here about her home language, the language that she grew up speaking. She says, soon I shall have every coloured molecule of it. It may by now be a lie, banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. So it seems like she's describing a situation here where her home language, the language she spoke when she was a child, has actually been banned in the country of her origin, in the country that she comes from. But she says, but I can't get it off my tongue. She's not willing to let it go. She's not willing to give up that part of her identity, which is the language that she grew up speaking. She says it tastes of sunlight. Interesting bit of imagery there. And again, she's ended the stanza with the word sunlight. So my first question there in the orange box, which you should pause and answer, is why you think every stanza ends on the word sunlight. And then the second question, looking at the bit in purple, I want you to pause and see if you can identify the language devices that are being used here. Can you annotate your thoughts about the language device she's chosen and the effect? Hopefully you've had a chance to annotate a little bit now. So I'm hoping that you looked at the word sunlight on the end of each stanza, and you made a note of the fact that no matter what she discusses in the stanza, no matter what sort of negative aspects she's thinking about, at the end of the day, she always comes back to that feeling of immense positivity and optimism when she thinks about her homeland. So sunlight, if you think of connotations of sunlight, you'd be thinking of ideas like hope and joy, very much positive associations with that word. And then looking at the bit in purple, hopefully you realize that there's some metaphorical language there as well as a simile. So the bit about time rolling its tanks, there's a nice link there by talking about tanks. I put the image in the corner to give you a bit of a clue to the idea of warfare. And she does say that her city is now war-torn, it's sick with tyrants, it's at war. So the idea of time passing is linked here to the actual conflict that's going on in the city. She says the frontiers rise between us. Frontiers, you may have had to look that word up. It's sort of like a border between countries. So when she says the frontiers rise between us close like waves, she's talking about that feeling of separation, that she's sort of cut off from her homeland. Close like waves, you could think of the simile, the waves in the sea, kind of like a never-ending just this border that cannot be broken, it cannot be overcome. It just comes at her almost like waves in the ocean. Right, we're going to go on to the last stanza, which is stanza 3. Here she says, I have no passport, there's no way back at all. So literally she might have had her passport taken away when she left the country of her origin. Maybe she's had to take on a new citizenship in her new country, so you could read it literally like that. When she says there's no way back at all, she might mean like she's physically not allowed to go back to her home. because she's now a refugee, perhaps. So there's a whole lot of implications there about how, she actually literally cannot go back. Or you could see it as well as metaphorical, like that she can't go back. She maybe doesn't want to go back because then she'd have to face the reality that her memories and the truth are two different things here, and actually the place is not as perfect as she imagines it and as she remembers it. Okay, then she uses a lot of figurative language in this stanza. I'm not going to tell you too much because I again want you to annotate here. She says, my city comes to me in its own white plain, and she talks about how it lies down, docile as paper. I comb its hair. So I want you to think about, in this pink bit, annotate what language device is being used here and why you think the poem is using this language device to talk about her city in this way in the bits in pink. And then I've also highlighted the bit in green for you. And when you pause the video, I want you to look at the green bits where it talks about they accuse me of absence, they circle me, they accuse me of being dark. Think about who they might be that she keeps mentioning. Think about the feeling or the atmosphere Rumens is creating. And then look at the last line of the poem and think about how it contrasts. So take another pause here to write down your notes. Right, now that you've had a chance to jot down some ideas, looking back at the bit in pink, hopefully you notice straight away that she's using a lot of personification here. So when she talks about the city coming to her in a plain, lying down, how she combs its hair, the dancing, these are all things that we'd expect human beings to be doing. The city cannot literally do those things. So perhaps the poet here is trying to personify the city to show that she loves her city almost in the way that you would love a person. You can see the feeling of affection when she talks about combing its hair and loving its shining eyes. It's something you would do for somebody that you really loved, like maybe a child, for instance. So it's almost like she sees the city as like a person that she loves. When she says, my city takes me dancing, dancing has connotations of celebration and joy. So again, we get this impression that her memories bring her positive feelings. They bring her joy when she thinks about them. The bit in green creates a really different atmosphere. So the bit in green is a lot more, I feel like there's a sense of it, she feels threatened here. She feels uneasy. When she keeps talking about they, we don't exactly know who they is. Could they be the new people that she's met in her new city? She says they accuse me of being dark in their free city, which is what makes me think she's talking about how she feels like an outsider. She doesn't feel like she fits in her new free city, and she feels like she has to defend herself and defend the place that she comes from. She says, my city hides behind me. Again, that's personification. There's a sense here that she feels very protective over her homeland. She feels protective over the place that she's come from. So there's themes here of her feeling quite protective over her identity and who she is. And then the final line, she says, they mutter death and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. So there's a nice juxtaposition here between death and sunlight, death being dark and negative, but then once again she brings it back to the sunlight, that feeling of joy and positivity and optimism no matter what. So the whole idea we get in this poem is basically that no matter what she's told, no matter what difficulty she faces, no matter what terrible news she hears, she chooses to sort of resolutely believe in her homeland and to stay positive no matter what. So, as I mentioned, there are some key themes here that fit into the idea of power and conflict, which is the overarching theme of your anthology, as you know by now. So, some key notes to write down here. In terms of conflict, there's a lot of internal or emotional conflict going on here. The speaker in the poem is in conflict because she's torn between her childhood memories and then the reality of her adult understanding. So she knows the truth of what's going on in her homeland. She knows, she's seen the news, but her memories tell her almost that it's not true. So there's definitely a feeling of conflict there internally. In terms of external conflict, it is a factor here because she speaks about her homeland being at war. She says it's sick with tyrants. So the situation she finds herself in could be as a direct result of actual physical conflict, as in war, which is a theme you've looked at a lot in many of your other poems. And then we've also got the idea of the power of memory and the power of identity. So these are also themes that have come up in other poems that you've already done. You might already start to think about which particular poems you might compare this one to if you were thinking about the theme of memory or you were thinking about the theme of identity. Both of these themes are very evident because the speaker clearly has a really strong emotional connection to her homeland and her memories. She's very proud of her heritage, very proud of who she is, despite everything she's been through and despite the negativity around her homeland. So, as I said, you need to do your deeper annotations on 3 main quotes. So I've picked 3 for you. The first one I've picked is the one that says, "It may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants, but I'm branded by an impression of sunlight." You've got 4 boxes to fill in here, looking at the language, any themes, structure and form, and then thinking about the poet's intentions and the context. The second quote I've chosen for you is this one. "It may by now be a lie, banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. It tastes of sunlight." There she's talking about her language, her home language, remember, which she sort of brought with her, and she uses the metaphor of it being like a doll that she brought with her as a child. And then the last one is the one we've spoken about with the personification. "I comb its hair and love its shining eyes. My city takes me dancing through the city of walls." So those are your 3 main quotations. Make sure you copy them over and you do some detailed explosions and annotations on those 3 particular quotes. That is it. So I hope this has been really helpful, and good luck with your annotations. Do drop us a message if you need any more help with the poem. All the best.